Hello and welcome to Lyons Den. I am Maureen Lyons. I have two more storytellers here today, and actually we all tell stories all the time. We talk about our quirky family members or the funny things our pets do, and we describe places we visit. And by doing this, we bring to life our experiences and share them with others. Now, the people here today do that in different ways, but, excuse me, they're each memorable in what they choose to tell. Jo Radner is from Lovell, Maine, where her family's lived for centuries. And she creates and tells stories about family and Maine history. You're doing this since the 1980s.
Yes.
And Willie Find It is an unregistered Maine guide from Pinocchio Harbor, Maine, in Mythic County.
Yes, it's between York and Washington counties.
So that's a
Kind of
big
nestled
area.
in there amongst the glaciers.
So, Jo, would you start, please, by telling your story of Wimble Betty, who was a pioneer woman from Norway, Maine.
That's right. Sure. I'll be glad to tell it. I love this story. It chose me when I found it. This is a story of a strong woman, headstrong, smart, and at times outrageous. Her name was Elizabeth Stevens, Betty Stevens, but she got her nickname from one of those outrageous episodes. She was called Wimble Betty. You see, the Stevens family joined some others right after the Revolutionary War and traveled inland from the coast to be the first settlers who founded what became the town of Norway, Maine. It was not easy to be a first settler. Actually, there wasn't anything there. Everything was scarce except for trees and rocks and water. Anything else that the settlers in Norway needed, they had to carry or drag from the coast 45 miles through forests and across rivers and over hills. And they did get basically what they needed and occasionally something extra. On one occasion, the men of Norway pooled their resources, went to Falmouth, which was in those days the name for Portland, and managed to buy a very large barrel of West Indian rum. And they dragged it all the way to Norway on a scoot sled. They got it there, they set it up on sawhorses in the cellar of the Hobbs family's cabin. It developed very soon that most evenings, most of the men of Norway had urgent business with the Hobbses. And they were coming home later and later, and in worse and worse condition, and their wives didn't know what to do about it until Wimble Betty got an idea. On a day when the men were off at a barn raising, Betty Stevens led a delegation of the wives to the Hobbs cabin. They went down in the cellar, and the other women held candles for light, while Betty got down underneath that big barrel with a wimble. It's an old-fashioned name for a hand drill. And she drilled a hole in the belly of the barrel, and all that rum poured out and soaked into the earthen floor of the barrel, of the cellar. Well, that evening, when the men found out what had happened to their hard-won liquor, there was so much rage in Norway that some of the women were so frightened they turned state's evidence and they said that it had been Betty's idea, which it had. And if Betty hadn't barricaded herself into the loft of her cabin, she would have been mobbed. But eventually, the rage died down. The memory did not. This is Maine. And she was called Wimble Betty ever after. So the story I want to tell you takes place a year or two after that, when they finally completed a road from Falmouth all the way in past the settlements to Norway, a road that a wagon could travel. And just as soon as a wagon could make it across that road, a peddler with the ominous name of Wiley Swift planned his very first marketing journey into the back country. He got his wagon all set, and then just before he set off, a ship docked in Falmouth from Cuba with a load of molasses and something that even at that time on the coast was unusual, coconuts. Wiley saw those and he said, you know, they won't have seen those in the back country. They'll be a real novelty, ha! I bet I could get 6 to a shilling for each of them. And that was a lot of money. So he loaded up a couple dozen coconuts and set off on his journey. He went from settlement to settlement to settlement, doing pretty good business, with one exception. Nobody bought coconuts. Whether they were too weird or too expensive or both, you know, people in the back country, they didn't have much cash money. Whatever they needed, they bartered for things that they'd grown or made or trapped and worked hard to get. So they weren't about to spend that on something like a coconut. So there came a day when Willie realized he had his whole load of coconuts left and only one more settlement to visit, and that was Norway. He was getting desperate. Well, he happened to arrive in Norway on a morning when, again, the men were away. They were at a militia muster. So when he pulled his wagon into the dooryard of the Eastman farm, Nabby Eastman came out alone. Willie reached down into the wagon bed, brought up a coconut. "Madam, see what I have brought for you." "What's that?" As soon as he saw that she didn't know what it was, his imagination ran wild. "Madam, this is the egg of a gorgeously beautiful bird known as the gollywhopper. It's not so tall as an ostrich, but it's taller than your turkey. Why, you could hatch this egg under your goose, or if your goose refused to set, wrap it in a little flannel and tuck it in the corner of your fireplace. This egg will hatch in precisely 22 days. Well, Nabby Eastman was a practical woman. She said, "What do I want with a gollywhaker?" "Madam, it's a gollywhopper." I would say that no animal is more useful than a gollywhopper on a new farm where chickens and ducks, and I see you have sheep, lambs are being raised. Why, its peculiar cries will frighten off owls, hawks, foxes, wolves, even bears. Why, I have seen a gollywhopper chase a fox 1.5 miles without stopping. It is a true fact, madam, that no farm protected by gollywhoppers has ever been afflicted by these terrible pests. Furthermore, its beautiful green and red feathers are much prized. Southern women use them to trim their hats." Well, as he spoke, He could see her eyes getting wider and wider, and he knew he had her. She bought 2 so she could raise a flock, and she gave him 3 otter pelts that her husband had trapped. He was off and running. He went from farm to farm to farm, and when one housewife heard that her neighbors were about to raise a profitable flock of gollywhoppers, she had to have some too. He got retted flax, sheepskins, beaver pelts, all kinds of valuable material. And business was so good that by the time noon came, dinner time, he had only 1 coconut left and only 1 farm left to visit, and that was Wimble Betty's farm. So Wiley pulled into the dooryard, and Wimble Betty came out, and he reached down and picked up his last coconut. "Madam, see what I have done. I have saved my last gollywhopper's egg for you." Wimble Betty was not like the other women of the settlement. She had spent her youth in Old Salem, which at that time was a port rivaling Boston. And she had seen a lot of ships dock and a lot of cargoes unloaded. And she knew a coconut when she saw one. But she knew how to hold her tongue. So she said, "What did you say that was?" And Wiley launched into his by now well-practiced patter, explained to her that hers would be the only farm unprotected by gollywhoppers in the whole settlement if she didn't buy this one. And he told her, she got him to tell her what her neighbors had paid for it. Later on, she said her mind had flashed back to the matter of the West Indian rum, when the women had turned against her, and she had almost let them hatch their eggs. But he was too outrageous. So she said, "Well, how much do you want for it?" "Oh, madam, since it's my last one, and since it's you, I could let you have it for 2 shillings and 6pence, which in today's money might be between $20 and $30. "Oh, I don't have that kind of cash money. I have an idea, though. Why don't we give your horse a feed, and I'll fix you some dinner, and you can have your dinner and have a smoke in the house while I go to my neighbors and try to borrow the money." Well, it was fine with him. So she got the horse and wagon closed into the barn. She gave him his dinner. And then Wimble Betty took off down that road. She got to the Eastman farm, wasted no time giving Nabby Eastman a short lecture on tropical botany. Then they went from farm to farm to farm, until Wimble Betty had marching behind her down that new road 7 pioneer women carrying coconuts and pitchforks.
Yes, that's the way to go.
Those wonderful colonial pitchforks, you know, the 2 long, sharpened tines. She was a good general. She led them around behind her cabin where there were no windows, and they secured the barn. Meanwhile, in the house, Wiley Swift had had a good dinner, and he was seated smoking his pipe with his feet up on the hearth, thinking how it had turned out to be a fairly profitable day after all. He had no inkling that his fortunes were going to change until a coconut came bouncing in the door, followed by Wimble Betty. "You thief! You're going to pay back my neighbors everything you took from them by fraud." "I am not." He elbowed past her, shoved his way out the door, ran for the barn, only to be confronted by 14 sharpened pitchfork tines wielded by sturdy pioneer women who knew how to pitch hay. It was a choice: surrender or perforation. All right, ladies, I surrender. Just let me go in and get my wagon. I'll give you back your goods. But Wimble Betty was having none of that. No, sir. A man that'll tell one lie will tell two. I'll get the goods. She went into the barn. She pushed out the wagon. The women pitched in their coconuts, took out what they'd paid for them. And then Wimble Betty turned to him again. She said, "And now, you golly whopper, there's one more thing. You owe me for a feed for your horse and for your dinner. And once you've given me 2 packs of needles, 2 packs of pins, and 3 hanks of linen thread, we'll call it square." He paid up. She gave him his horse. He drove off a wiser man. Her great-nephew, C.A. Stevens of Norway, said that Wimble Betty lived to be 94, and that in all that time, her character did not change. That's the story of Wimble Betty.
I love her.
Such a great story.
Yes. Now, how do you pick the people or the people in history that you tell stories about? You go to historical societies, libraries?
Well, sometimes I read. I've discovered over the years that I actually have certain preferences. I like people who deal with difficult circumstances with a certain amount of humor and courage. And I have a lot of stories about people like that. And I think that humor and gravity go together some ways. If you make people laugh first, they trust you. You have a sense of perspective. They'll cry with you later. And that's a pretty well-known fact for storytellers. So I look for that, but I also look for stories particularly about Mainers. I have a CD. Can I show it?
Sure.
Yankee Ingenuity, Stories of Headstrong and Resourceful People. And what I've done, Wimble Betty is the first story on that. What I've done with that CD is chosen stories about Mainers in particular, historical ones, but ones that make me think in a certain way. So there's a story about the man, and he was from Maine, who invented the machine gun. Well, that's an achievement, and it's also got its somber side. There's a story about the man from Otisfield, actually East Otisfield, who believed that he had proved that the earth was flat and the sun and stars moved around it. But there's also some family stories there. And
well, I know you've taken stories that you tell from your own family history, but how do you find these other people?
Usually just reading. But some of my most important stories, I think, the ones that are most important to me, are stories that people have actually given me because they feel important, but they're not stories they can tell. My favorite of all the stories I've made is called Burnt into Memory, and it's about an hour long. It's a story of the 1947 fire that destroyed Brownfield, Maine. There was a lot of it here in Biddeford, too. I know it was there were fires all over Maine that year. But Brownfield is very near to Lovell, and I was working in the Brownfield Denmark school, and I was teaching every class in the school to do oral history interviewing, teaching them how to ask other people questions that would lead them to tell them stories, which is the best of interviewing, as you know, as a good interviewer. And some of them wanted to work on the fire. it is, next week it will be the 65th anniversary of the fire, as a matter of fact.
I remember when it was the 50th. There were things all over
right.
the post office and newspapers, and it's 65 already.
Well, in those days, there were still people, there are still 3 men left alive who fought the fire. But there were more then, and I did oral history for the Brownfield Historical Society for about a year, collecting their stories. And none of the people wanted to tell their stories. We said, this is important, but we don't want to tell those stories. We don't talk about the fire, but we want people to know what we experienced. So as a kind of tribute to them, I've made that story.
And people won't be able to see the information for your story tonight, won't be on today, but you'll already have told your story at the Falmouth
Historical Society.
You're going to speak about the
But I tell it from
brownfield.
time to time in various places.
So maybe you'll do that
People
here.
can contact me through my website about it.